The sun hit Redvale's dusty square like a hammer when the sheriff lifted his voice and offered a 19-year-old girl to the highest bidder. Lily kept her head bowed, a bruise fading beneath her hair, the crowd studying her the way vultures study the dying. And just when the heat felt unbearable, Elias Monroe stepped out of the shadow of a wagon, placing his last handful of gold on the table. A black man buying a white girl. Gasps, outrage, the kind that can split a town in two. Lily did not lift her eyes, but if she had, they would have shown no hope at all, only the ash left after a fire burns too long. Yet beneath her worn shoe hid a key no one knew about, and behind Elias's silence lived a past, sharp enough to cut stone. Neither of them were what this town believed, and what happened on that square was only the spark. If stories where justice collides with fate speak to you, stay close and subscribe. The truth buried beneath Redvale is just beginning to stir. The sheriff's voice dragged across the scorched air, slow and heavy, as if even the wind refused to carry the words. 19-year-old Lily Callahan, up on that splintered platform, kept her head pruned while the dust swirled around her ankles like something alive. The sun pressed down on Redvale's square with a cruelty that felt personal, baking every whispered comment into the ground. People weren't just watching an auction. They were watching a sentence being carried out. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Caleb Red Holloway stepped forward, his eyes gleaming the way a man looks at something he wants to break. Wyatt Hale followed, a grin stretched too thin, the kind of smile a parent warns their children about. Their bids came sharp and eager, cutting into the stillness. 20, 25, 30. Each word dropped like a hammer, each number a reminder that to them, Lily wasn't a person. She was a prize, a possession. At the back of the square, Elias Monroe felt something old and aching twist inside him. He'd come only to witness, he told himself, not to intervene. But the past has a way of splitting open at the worst moment. Evelyn's face flickered in his memory, the way they humiliated her, how she'd stood in this very square years before, hands shaking, dignity stripped by men who believed themselves untouchable. And then Jonah, his boy, gone before anyone in town bothered to care. His fist tightened until the leather of his glove creaked. $30. That was everything he'd saved for seed, for one last chance at keeping his land alive. But as he watched Holloway's hand rise again, watched Lily flinch ever so slightly under the heat and the stares, something inside him snapped clean. 50. The word fell out of him like a shot. The crowd froze. Heads turned, some in disbelief, some in disgust, a few in something darker. Her father didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight as he watched strangers bid for his daughter, like she was a mule. Elias caught the man's eyes and saw nothing there. Not anger, not grief, just vacancy and greed waiting to be satisfied. Holloway smirked. Hale chuckled. The sheriff cleared his throat. The moment stretched, long enough for Elias to feel the weight of the choice grinding down his spine. Then he said it. $70. Gold. A gasp tore through the square. Men stiffened. Women pulled their children closer. Even the sheriff faltered, his voice stumbling as he tried to steady the ritual. A black man outbidding white men for a white girl. In Redvale, that wasn't just a purchase. It was an insult, a provocation, a spark drifting too close to dry grass. Lily lifted her head for the first time. Just a fraction. Just enough for Elias to see her eyes beneath the stray strands of hair. They weren't pleading. They weren't shattered. They were watching him with a quiet, razor-edged clarity, as if she were measuring him against something only she understood. Not hope, not trust, something colder, sharper. Then the gavel fell, sealing all of their fates in a single, echoing crack. The moment the gavel's echo faded, the crowd shifted as if a single breath passed through 100 throats at once. Then the whispers rose, sharp, poisoned, hungry. They trailed Elias Monroe as he guided Lily off the platform, clinging to him like burrs in dry grass. People didn't bother to lower their voices. They wanted him to hear every word. A black man thinks he can buy a white girl. Someone stop him. Someone teach him his place. Redvale had always been a town that pretended its hatred was just tradition. But today, the mask slipped. Holloway pushed through the bodies, boots grinding into the dust. He spat at the ground near Elias's feet, the spit sizzling under the sun. You won't keep her long, Monroe. Not in this town. The threat hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. Elias didn't answer. He didn't blink. He simply placed himself between Holloway and the trembling girl beside him before guiding her toward the waiting wagon. Lily walked as though her bones remembered pain even when her mind tried not to. Every step sent a subtle shiver through her shoulders, the kind of flinch born not from fear of a new master, but from the ghosts of old ones. She didn't look at Elias, not directly. She kept her gaze fixed on the dust rising around her shoes, on the straps of the worn sandals she'd tied too tightly, on the ground that had met her knees too many times before. When they reached the wagon, she hesitated, waiting for the blow that never came. Elias noticed it, the pause, the breath she held like a shield. He offered his hand without touching her. "You don't have to fear me," he said quietly. "I will not hurt you." The words didn't fall heavy. They floated, fragile, as if he knew she might not believe them. But something in the stillness made her lift her eyes just long enough for him to see a flicker inside them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. The faint surprise of someone who expected a fist and received mercy instead. She climbed onto the wagon, careful, controlled. As Elias took the reins, Lily leaned slightly forward, adjusting her shoe under the hem of her skirt. A tiny movement, almost nothing. But her fingers disappeared beneath the leather for just a moment too long. Elias didn't notice. The crowd didn't notice. No one saw the way her hand brushed a hidden bulge inside the worn sole. No one saw the glint of metal she pressed back into place with the ease of familiarity. The wagon lurched forward, rolling out of the square and away from the voices that cursed their names. Houses thinned, then vanished behind them, swallowed by open land. The air grew quieter, but not safer. Redvale's hatred had a long reach. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. Lily kept hers on the path beneath them, and the key tucked inside her shoe remained warm against her skin, as if it understood more than either of them that this journey was about to crack open a storm neither the town nor its sinners would ever forget. Night had already settled by the time the wagon reached the tree line, that dense stretch of forest where the world seemed to hold its breath. The cabin emerged slowly from the shadows, a modest shape tucked between oak trunks and the remnants of a garden long bullied by drought. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but something about the way Elias stepped down from the wagon told Lily this was no ordinary refuge. It was a place built from quiet, from loss, from a man trying to stitch together whatever pieces of his life still remained. Inside, the air shifted. It wasn't the smell of whiskey or sweat or rage, the odors she had grown used to surviving. Instead, the cabin held the faint scent of cedar and lamp oil, and a level of order that bordered on discipline. Books lined a handmade shelf with near-military precision. A modest table had been polished until the grain glowed softly beneath the lamplight. Tools were placed deliberately, as if everything in the room had been chosen, not accumulated. Nothing was chaotic, nothing was cruel. Lily paused at the threshold, eyes scanning instinctively. She marked the window hinges, the distance to the door, the shadows where a man could hide. Her breath stayed shallow, her muscles ready for the familiar snap of violence. But Elias simply lit another lamp, letting its warm glow spill across the walls like a gentle hand smoothing out wrinkles. He didn't look at her when he spoke. Maybe he didn't want to startle her. Maybe the words needed their own space to breathe. "This place is quiet," he said. "Has been for a long time, since my wife Evelyn passed. And my boy, Jonah." His voice didn't break. It didn't even waver. The pain in it wasn't fresh. It was worn, weathered, like a stone shaped by years of tide. Lily had heard men lie with their voices before, softening their stories to earn pity. This was not that. This was a man stating a fact the world could never rewind. She found herself staring at his profile in the lamplight, the restrained sadness etched into the lines around his eyes. There was no anger radiating from him, no hunger for control. Only a weight he carried alone because there had never been anyone willing to carry it with him. Footsteps sounded on the porch. Lily froze, but Elias lifted a hand, calm and steady. "It's just Ruth." The door creaked open, and a middle-aged black woman stepped inside, her presence filling the room with an authority that didn't need announcing. She placed a basket on the table, glanced at Lily with eyes far too knowing, then nodded to Elias. Food, supplies, and word. Her tone hinted at storms gathering somewhere beyond the trees, but she didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The look she shared with Elias said enough. She left as quickly as she arrived, the door closing behind her like a punctuation mark. After she was gone, Elias exhaled. There are bounty hunters combing the eastern woods, hired by the mayor after some men escaped the Sullivan place. They won't ask questions in the dark, not the kind that matter. Lily remembered the way voices had sliced through the square earlier. The hatred sharpened into something almost feral. Running now would mean running straight into that same hatred, armed and hungry. Her pulse tightened. She looked at Elias again. Really looked. At the structure of his posture. At the way he put space between them, not out of fear, but out of respect. At the lack of threat in his hands. At the quiet intelligence in the books he kept. The careful order of a man who fought the world with his mind long before he raised his voice. He was nothing like the men she had known. Later, in the room he offered her, Lily lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling, waiting for the sound of a lock turning, waiting for footsteps, waiting for the script of her life to repeat itself. But none of it came. When dawn finally slipped around the cracks in the shutters, she rose and opened the door, bracing for the worst. Instead, she found the cabin empty. The front door stood wide open, letting in the scent of dew and earth. Elias was outside, working the stubborn soil with a hoe, his posture steady, his focus utterly elsewhere. He hadn't locked her in. He hadn't even tried. For the first time in years, Lily realized she was not trapped, and for the first time in her life, she didn't quite know what to do with the sudden, terrifying possibility of choice. The warning came not through words, but through vibration, the distant tremor of hooves rolling over dry earth. Elias felt it before he heard it, the way a tree senses lightning before the sky cracks open. Lily, standing near the window, stiffened as three riders emerged from between the oaks, their silhouettes cut through the morning haze like blades, moving with the careless confidence of men who had never once questioned their right to intrude. Holloway rode in front, his boots dangling arrogantly from the stirrups, dust rising around him in dirty plumes. Wyatt Hale followed, leaning forward with the amused slouch of a predator who spots fresh fear. But it was the third rider who changed the air entirely. Judge Harrington sat tall in the saddle, posture straight as a bayonet, his tailored coat far too fine for Redvale's back roads. Even before he spoke, the threat in him glimmered like a thin layer of oil on water. Elias stepped outside, closing the cabin door behind him with a quiet finality. He didn't tell Lily to stay inside. He didn't need to. She hovered just behind the window frame, watching through a slit in the curtain. Harrington tapped the dust off his gloves, each motion deliberate, polished, rehearsed. "Mr. Monroe," he greeted, voice smooth enough to hide the teeth beneath. "The county is conducting suitability inspections. We've had reports that your land is no longer productive, and unproductive land, as you know, may be reassigned for better use." Hale chuckled. Holloway spat. A familiar little orchestra of intimidation. Elias didn't flinch. He planted his feet the way men do when they've been pushed so often they've learned the exact inch where they refuse to move anymore. "My taxes are paid," he said. "On time, every season. The land is registered under my name with federal documentation." He let the words settle, then added, "Unless, Judge, you'd like to explain to Washington why you're rewriting property law without cause." For a heartbeat, Harrington's smile thinned. Lily felt it, felt the power shift, subtle but unmistakable. Elias wasn't just a farmer, he wasn't just a widower, he was a man who read books most people in Redvale had never heard of, a man whose mind was as disciplined as the shelves inside his cabin. And the judge hadn't expected that. Harrington's voice sharpened. "Times change, Mr. Monroe. The needs of the county change." "Only when there's profit buried underneath," Elias replied. The judge's eyes flashed, just once, a flicker, but Lily caught it. She'd seen that look before at her father's meetings, the look men get when a plan much larger than they admit is threatened. Suddenly, the dry farmland outside the cabin didn't look worthless at all. It looked strategic, desired, dangerous. Holloway nudged his horse closer, lowering his voice with mock sympathy. "You can fight, Monroe, but you won't win. Not against us." Elias didn't bother to look at him. He kept his gaze on Harrington, the real serpent in the trio. "This land was chosen for a reason, Judge, years before any of you cared about it, and I won't be bullied off it." The tension thickened, settling over the clearing like storm clouds without thunder. Lily felt her heartbeat rise. The way Elias held his ground wasn't reckless. It was precise, controlled, the stance of a man who didn't oppose injustice out of pride, but out of principle. And something in her shifted. This wasn't just about keeping a roof over his head. This wasn't a fight for one man's survival. Elias Monroe was standing in the doorway of something much bigger, and Redvale's most powerful men knew it. As the riders finally turned back toward town, dust swirling like wildfire around their horses' hooves, Lily understood something she hadn't been ready to see before. Elias wasn't just protecting his land, he was preparing for a war she had unknowingly stepped into the moment she'd been sold on that platform. Ruth Carter returned 2 days later, but this time she didn't bother knocking. She slipped into the clearing the way a wolf slips between trees, silent and certain, her covered wagon creaking under the weight of sacks and jars, and something far heavier than supplies. Lily sensed it before Ruth even spoke. A tension, a purpose, the kind of urgency that doesn't arrive by accident. Ruth set a bundle on the table, brushing off dust with the back of her hand. Seeds, dried herbs, salves, things a simple neighbor might bring, but then she reached into her coat and produced a thin envelope, sealed in wax the color of dried blood. The room tightened around it. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Elias took the letter without a word. His face was calm, almost blank, the expression he always wore when preparing himself for impact. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and the lamplight caught the fine script inside. Lily watched the change ripple across him like a shadow passing over water. First stillness, then a slow, controlled inhale, and finally something sharper, resolve hardening into steel. Ruth tilted her head, waiting. Elias lowered the paper. "They're moving faster than we thought," he said, voice low. "Judge Harrington, Mayor Marshall, and your father, Lily, they're all tied to this." He didn't accuse her. He didn't raise his voice, but the truth in his words cut cleanly, and Lily felt the slice. Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the table to steady herself, but the wood beneath her palms felt foreign, slippery. Elias turned to her fully now, not with suspicion, but with a question that carried the weight of everything he hadn't asked since he bought her life for $70. "Lily, what did you hear at those meetings?" She should have lied. She had been raised to lie, trained to stay silent until her tongue grew numb. But Elias's eyes held no threat, only necessity, only that unyielding determination she had begun to recognize in him, the kind that didn't demand the truth for power, but for survival. Her voice when it came was barely a whisper. "My father kept a ledger, a red book, names, payments, dates, land deeds, bribes, meetings with Marshall, plans to seize the riverfront lots before the railroad arrives." She swallowed, breath shuddering. They called it insurance. Insurance that no one could challenge them. And when I overheard too much, her voice cracked, thin as old paper. He decided I wasn't worth the risk. The words hung there, trembling, as though they themselves were afraid to exist. Ruth exhaled sharply, not surprised but angered in a quiet, contained way that felt more dangerous than rage. Elias didn't move toward Lily, didn't touch her, didn't crowd her. He simply stood there, letting her speak, letting her dismantle the last pieces of the silence forced upon her. Lily's eyes glossed over as she pressed on. "He told the mayor I was slipping, that I asked questions, that I saw the book when I shouldn't have." She shook her head, struggling for breath. "They didn't want to punish me. They wanted to erase me. Selling me on that platform." She couldn't finish the sentence. Ruth stepped closer, placing a small, firm hand on Lily's shoulder. "You're not erased, child. Not while we're here. Not while the truth breathes." And that was when it broke. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single tear slipping down Lily's cheek, so soft she didn't notice it until it reached her jaw. She froze, startled by her own humanity, as if she'd forgotten tears were something she was allowed to have. For Elias, that tear was a turning point, a decision, a vow forming in the air between them. He folded the letter with care, set it beside Ruth's basket, and looked at Lily with a steadiness that felt almost like shelter. "We're not running," he said. "Not anymore." Because now, with the truth finally dragged into the light, the storm gathering over Redvale had a name, and it had begun. The storm reached Redvale before midnight, rolling in like a beast dragging its claws across the sky. Rain battered the rooftops with a violence that felt almost deliberate, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash the town clean of its sins. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the muddy streets in harsh, momentary flashes. Each strike threw long shadows across the buildings, turning Redvale into a flickering reel of a noir film no one asked to star in. Under that relentless downpour, a single figure moved along the back alley behind Town Hall. Lily's black cloak clung to her like a second skin, soaked to the bone, the fabric whispering against her legs with each quick, deliberate step. She kept her head low, avoiding lantern light, slipping into blind spots as if she'd studied the building her entire life. In truth, she had. Every lie her father whispered in those halls, every secret meeting she wasn't supposed to hear, had carved the map she now followed. The door to Mayor Marshall's office loomed ahead, heavy oak, reinforced hinges. But Lily didn't hesitate. She reached into her shoe and withdrew the small, ornate key that had changed everything the moment she stole it. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the cold clarity of purpose. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, obedient click. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco, ink, and ambition rotting from the inside out. Thunder rattled the windows as Lily closed the door and moved straight to the cabinet behind the desk. She didn't search. She knew exactly where the mayor kept the files the town wasn't supposed to see. The drawer slid open to reveal stacks of papers bound in twine, each one stamped with county seals, signatures, and maps. Railroad schematics, land transfers, bribes disguised as development incentives. She gathered everything, stuffing the damning documents into the hollow lining of her cloak. With each stack she pulled, the shape of the conspiracy sharpened, revealing how deep the roots ran and how many lives had been set up to burn. A fresh boom of thunder masked the sound of the window rattling. Lily froze, breath stopping in her throat. But no one came, no footsteps, just the storm screaming its warnings across the sky. She slipped out as silently as she had entered, the door locking behind her with a soft click that felt like justice preparing to wake. While Lily confronted shadows in town hall, Elias Monroe stepped into the telegraph office on the opposite end of the town. The lamps flickered from the wind, casting long, jittery shapes across the counters. Mr. Bradley, the telegraph operator, looked up from his papers, his expression cautious but not surprised. Elias's presence, drenched and unshaken, spoke for itself. "I need to send a wire," Elias said, sliding a folded sheet across the desk. "Columbia College." The name alone carried the weight of his past, the man he'd once been allowed to become before the world tried to press him back into silence. Bradley read the first few lines, and his eyes changed, not widened, hardened. He nodded once, a small but unmistakable gesture of allegiance. No words, no questions. Just a quiet promise that he would carry this message into the veins of the country where real power still listened. He began tapping the key, each metallic click echoing like bullet casings on a floor. Rain hammered the windows. Elias stood watch, feeling the storm inside him match the storm outside, both building towards something inevitable. Two missions, two paths carved through the dark, one purpose. Lily racing through the night with the truth strapped beneath her cloak. Elias sending word to the only man who could pull a thread strong enough to unravel an empire. Lightning flashed again, white hot, turning Redvale into a frozen photograph for a single breath. And in that moment, every secret the town tried to bury seemed to hover on the edge of revelation. If you believe storms are where truth begins to rise, like embers reigniting under heavy rain, go on, and like this video, leave a comment, and let us know you're walking through this night with us. At sunrise, Redvale woke not to birdsong, but to the hiss of a steam whistle cutting through the morning haze. A special train, slate gray and official, groaned to a halt at the tiny station. Three figures stepped onto the platform, their polished boots striking the wood with purpose. A representative from the Continental Railroad, a federal officer from the Department of the Interior, and a reporter from New York whose notebook seemed to flick open on its own, hungry for scandal. Their arrival sent a tremor through the town, even before anyone understood why they were here. They didn't have to wait long. Ruth Carter moved through Main Street like a slow-moving storm of her own, calm but unstoppable. She carried papers tucked under her arm, each one stamped with evidence Lily had stolen under cover of the storm. She posted the first sheet on the church door, then the market wall, then the side of Holloway's tavern. Dozens of copies fluttered in the morning breeze, like white flags of surrender the guilty hadn't meant to raise. People gathered, first a handful, then dozens, then the entire town, pushing in, straining to read the words that peeled back the skin of Redvale and showed the rot underneath. Every map, every forged deed, every bribe recorded in elegant handwriting. As the crowd swelled, the whispers rose with it, turning from confusion into recognition, and then into something far hotter. Harrington, Marshall, Holloway, Hale, 4 names circled in red. When Mayor Marshall stumbled out of the tavern, still buttoning his vest, he found half the town staring at him with new eyes, not fearful, not deferential, accusing. The railroad representative lifted one of the papers, tapping it lightly. "These documents carry your signature, Mayor. Would you like to explain why the proposed route coincidentally diverts across land recently acquired through illegal seizures?" Marshall's throat bobbed. "It's a forgery. All of it. Lies meant to—" But the federal officer cut him off, voice cold as metal. "We have the originals, delivered anonymously to our office last night." And then the real break in the scene came, swift and sharp. Lily Callahan stepped forward. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, reclaiming her body, her cloak falling back as she reached the open space at the center. Faces turned toward her, stunned. Holloway's jaw slackened. Hale cursed under his breath. Her father, Mr. Callahan, stood frozen at the edge, pale as unbaked clay. Lily's voice didn't tremble, not once. "You sold me," she said, her eyes locked onto her father's. "You sold me the way you sold every piece of this town. You sold its people, its land, its future, all for the price of your own greed." A collective gasp rolled through the square. Callahan staggered forward, his hands shaking so violently he looked nearly drunk on rage. "You ungrateful girl! You were never worth—" His sentence collapsed under the weight of his own humiliation. He sank to his knees, fingers clawing the dirt, howling words that no longer held power over her. Lily did not look away. And then Elias Monroe stepped forward, not grandly, not loudly, but with a steady gravity that shifted the entire energy of the square. When he spoke, it wasn't to attack. It was to reclaim what had always belonged to the people of Redvale. Every person in this town is worth more than any price you tried to put on them. Human dignity is not for sale, not to you, not to anyone. His words hit harder than any accusation. They struck marrow. They dismantled the very foundation of Redvale's hierarchy. In the silence that followed, the sheriff stepped behind Holloway and Hale, clasping iron cuffs around their wrists. Harrington attempted to flee through the back alley, only to find two federal officers blocking the way. Marshall tried to argue, but his voice cracked into incoherence as the reporter scribbled every detail, immortalizing his downfall. Chaos surged, but it was a different kind of chaos. Not the chaos of fear, the chaos of awakening. People who had once bowed their heads now stood taller. Those who had whispered in corners now spoke boldly. Redvale was burning, but not with fire, with revelation. The powerful men who had ruled it for years were dragged from their thrones in a matter of minutes, undone by the truth they believed would never surface. And at the center of it all stood Lily and Elias, side by side, the storm clouds finally breaking above them. Not victims, not fugitives, catalysts, the match and the spark that turned Redvale inside out. 6 months later, Redvale looked nothing like the town that once tried to swallow its own sins. Dawn spilled over the valley in soft gold, catching on the iron rails that now cut clean and purposeful across Elias Monroe's land. The new railroad gleamed like a promise laid straight through, shagged through the heart of a place that had nearly collapsed under its own darkness. And when the morning freight rolled in, its whistle rose into the sky not as a warning, but as a celebration. Children ran to the fence to watch it pass, their laughter rising with the smoke, scattering across the fields like birds finally freed. Where Elias's modest cabin once stood alone, a cluster of new structures now formed the beginnings of a real community, a workshop, a communal garden, and at the center, a wooden schoolhouse built by hands that had once known only labor, not possibility. Its windows caught the morning sun and scattered it across the yard in warm shards of yellow light. Dust swirled in the beams like drifting gold. Inside that schoolhouse, Lily Monroe stood before a group of 20 children, black, white, immigrant, all seated at desks Elias had carved himself. She wore no cloak now, no mask of fear, only a calm certainty that came from surviving the kind of fire that burns away everything untrue. Her voice had changed too. It carried confidence, not as a performance, but as a natural consequence of finally having a place in the world. She wrote a word on the chalkboard: history. The children leaned in, eager, trusting. Lily looked at them and saw pieces of herself, some shy, some bruised by life, some hungry for hope. And she understood something she once thought impossible. She was shaping a future she had never been allowed to imagine. When the lesson ended, Elias stepped into the doorway, wiping sawdust from his hands. His hair had grayed at the temples, but his posture held a steadiness that felt deeper now, more rooted. The kind of man who had endured the worst and still chose to build. He called the children outside, where the sun had begun to burn away the morning chill. They gathered under the wide branches of an oak tree newly revived by the season's rain. Elias crouched beside a worn stump and beckoned the children close. Freedom, he told them, isn't just breaking chains. Anyone can swing a hammer once. Real freedom is building a table where everyone has a place to sit. The children nodded, thoughtful, some tracing the grain of the stump, as if feeling the truth settle into their bones. A girl lingered nearby, one of the newer students, quiet and unsure. Lily crouched to meet her eyes. When things break, she said softly, they don't lose their worth. Sometimes broken things reflect light in ways whole things never could. The girl's eyes brightened, and she took Lily's hand. Behind them, Ruth Carter strode across the yard carrying a stack of supplies. She ruled the place with the warm authority of someone who had seen communities fall apart and knew exactly how to rebuild them. Sheriff Jensen followed, laughing, as two boys tugged him toward the new station platform, eager to show him their latest train schedule drawing. Even Mr. Bradley stopped by, tipping his hat toward Elias with a quiet pride, knowing the telegraph he sent months ago had helped turn the tide. Redvale was no longer defined by fear or silence. It hummed with life, with work, with people who had finally realized they belonged to one another. As the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the schoolyard, Elias and Lily walked side by side toward the ridge overlooking the tracks. The wind carried the scent of sawdust, blooming wildflowers, and the faint metallic tang of the rails, an alchemy of past and future mixing in the air. Neither of them spoke at first. They didn't need to. The transformation unfolding below them said everything. A town reborn from ash, a landscape reshaped by courage, and two souls who had clawed their way back into the light. Finally, Lily whispered, I never thought a place like this could exist. Elias looked at her, the fading sun turning his eyes almost amber. It didn't exist, he said, not until we built it. And as the last train of the day cut across the horizon, scattering sparks of orange light through the dust, Redvale stood as living proof that even the most broken towns, and the most broken people, can rise when truth is finally given room to breathe. In the end, Redvale's story was never truly about a girl sold on a dusty square or a man dismissed as less than the soil he worked. It was about what rose from the fracture, a young woman who had been treated as currency and a widower the town tried to erase, discovering that together they could ignite a truth powerful enough to remake an entire community. What began as an act of desperation became the spark that burned through layers of corruption, fear, and silence, revealing a town capable of far more than its darkest men ever imagined. Their journey reminds us that a person's worth is not measured in dollars or deeds stamped with stolen ink. It is measured in the courage to stand, to speak, to keep walking toward the light, even when the world insists you have none. Redvale learned that the hard way. And because of Lily and Elias, it will never forget. If this story found a place in you, stay with us, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts, so Black Soul Stories can continue to shine light into the corners where forgotten souls wait to be seen.